that bothers me too, because if God told me to sacrifice my son, I would seek my mom or my dad's counsel. I would seek my pastor's counsel. I'd probably wait a week at least, right? Or maybe a couple days. Maybe have time to talk to my spiritual advisor and to my friends, like weigh the pros and cons of this all. But it says here that Abraham went early the next morning. Not just the next morning, but early the next morning. Really? Really, Abraham? Early the next morning? It's that easy for him to go and sacrifice his son? I mean, I read these verses and I get so disgusted. Why is it so easy for Abraham? How could he go and do such a thing? I mean, later on we'll read how Abraham even raises up the knife to kill his son. Is it really, Abraham, aren't you? He's crazy. Even if God commanded it, that was rough, you know? After all, shouldn't Abraham have known that God wouldn't do such a thing? He wouldn't command Abraham to sacrifice his son, really. You know, it's just the test after all. Shouldn't Abraham have thought about how traumatic of an experience that would be for Isaac? Or for Sarah? Imagine going back to town and Sarah greeting you. Where have you been, Abraham? Oh, I was just gonna go sacrifice Isaac. But don't worry, God stopped me in time. Oh, shouldn't Abraham have known that God wasn't a violent God? That killing Isaac would mean an end to the promise? Imagine the love that Abraham and Sarah would have had for Isaac. Talk about a spoiled, rotten child. If you think that if you have a younger brother or sister, you might think that he's or she is spoiled, right? The youngest is always spoiled. And imagine Isaac being the most spoiled kid in history. Because he was basically the son and grandson of Abraham and Sarah, because they're really old, right, by now? So might as well be their grandson. And if you are a grandparent, then you know how you love to spoil your grandchildren. And he is not only this young, innocent boy, but he's the only kid. And so only kids usually are spoiled rotten by their parents, too. They get everything they want. But not only that, but Isaac was the promise of God. And if you're the promise of God, then you're special, right? So all their life, they've been waiting for this boy. And when they finally received this boy, maybe they spoiled him. Maybe they gave him everything they wanted. They loved him so much, they protected him. They sheltered him, maybe. Maybe if Abraham and Isaac back then had an iPhone, Abraham probably would have tracked Isaac's whereabouts 24/7, because after all, he holds the promise. So he has to be sheltered. And I imagine that Isaac probably couldn't go to his neighbor's house to play because, if anything happened, then that's it. That's the end of the promise. Or if he got food poisoning and died, what would happen then? So Abraham and Sarah probably sheltered him. Maybe he couldn't play with the other kids in town because what if he broke his leg and then he got an infection and died? It's too risky. So Abraham and Sarah just kept Isaac close. We see even beforehand that Sarah wouldn't even let Ishmael play with Isaac. Even that was too risky for Sarah. So I think that Isaac was probably really sheltered. So Abraham heard this voice commanding him to offer Isaac, his only son, as a burnt offering. And Abraham obeyed. We don't read any hesitation in the text, and that bothers me. It bothers me that Abraham could actually sleep that night. It said that he rose in the early morning, so that means that he slept after hearing that. If I heard that from God, I'd be tossing and turning in my sleep. I couldn't sleep. I'd probably just be interceding for God to change his mind the whole entire night. After all, isn't Abraham a friend of God? Couldn't he negotiate with God, But Abraham, he did what God told him to do with no hesitation, and maybe it's because he thought that it was normal. Maybe because he lived in the land of Canaan. Abraham saw the other inhabitants, the Canaanites, and they worshiped this god of fertility named El, like Chrislyn said. And El demanded that a portion of whatever they produced would be given to him. And so El, this fertility god, commanded even children to be sacrificed. And the sacrifice of children to El would ensure continued fertility. So maybe in Abraham's mind, Abraham thought that Yahweh, that God would make Sarah and him more fertile, maybe, if he sacrificed Isaac. I'm not sure. Maybe Abraham was so compliant to God because everyone else was doing it. It wasn't a strange request from God, since all the other gods were demanding it too. And so Abraham went, and he took Isaac and his male servants along with him. He brought everything that would be required for the sacrifice. He saddled up his donkey, and his donkey carried the wood and Isaac, and they started walking towards Moriah. Abraham is probably walking through some harsh terrain and passes by many other mountains in this mountainous region, and probably when he started getting closer, he thought, is it this mountain? Then he heard God say, no, and maybe he sighed, relief. Good, not this one, I still have time. And then he starts walking again, and he sees another mountain, and he says, is it this one? And again, God says no, and he's probably like, okay, good. I'm getting towards the end here. Maybe this is all a test, Maybe he'd just see if I'd go to that mountain. But then all of a sudden he hears God say this one. This mountain. After 3 full days of torture, of not knowing which mountain, finally God says, this one. During those 3 days, maybe Abraham had time to run away. He had time to say, God, no thanks. Maybe in his heart he thought God would take him through the mountains and say, psych, I was only joking. Or you've been on candid camera. But that wasn't the case, right? On the 3rd day, God said there, that mountain, that's the mountain that you're going to sacrifice. Losing a child is the most painful experience that a mother and father can go through. I've known some fathers and mothers who have lost a child, and they experience pain beyond measure. I mean, my cousin just lost her newborn baby, and that was rough. But here, Abraham and Sarah had known Isaac for 12 years or more. He already understood what was going on, and they've lived with him. They've had the chance to love him so much, so dearly, to hold him close, to feel Isaac's affection and attention. And I can't imagine working at a cancer hospital in the pediatric unit as a dietetic specialist. I saw so many parents who had to just sit by their child's bed and how much pain they were going through, seeing their child go through cancer, the pain, the nausea, the hurt. They just sat there helpless in anger, in anxiety and depression, with so much heaviness as they just sat there helpless. They couldn't do anything to help their child. And I saw that they were struggling so much. There was so much pain in them. But here in this story, Abraham wasn't helpless. He was the one who was going to have to hurt his son. God didn't give Isaac cancer to test Abraham's faith. God did not cause some sort